Welcome to Web Development Lesson 2.7. In this lesson, we're going to cover a concept called flexbox, which is going to enable us to create responsive design layouts for our web pages. You're going to be exploring a lot of mechanics behind using flexbox, and in a future lesson, we'll see the application to actual web page layouts. So let's get to it. So we have a simple design here of an outside container with a couple containers on the inside. We have a little bit of CSS to make the parent container background blue with a little bit of padding and the individual divs white with a little bit of margin. That's so you can physically see the divs. All right, so by default, divs are block elements, so they take up the whole width of the browser, and now they're stacked on top of each other. So I'm going to use inline styling for this first example, just so we can kind of reinforce where certain properties go. So this first div, the one that's housing the other elements, we're going to refer to as the parent. And then these divs that are inside, we're going to refer to them as the children. So the parent container needs to have a property called display flex. This is what's going to allow us to use flexbox with the stuff inside. So let's see what happens simply with setting that property. You notice that the divs are no longer block elements. They look like they're inline. But again, that's not a really good design layout. We need to kind of spread them out a little bit. So what the children can do is that they can get a property called flex and a number that represents how much they should take up of the whole space. So if I leave it with just one, what this is saying, let the first box flex for whatever space is available. And that's what you see here. So now if I go backwards and forwards, you'll see that this particular box is, flexing for as much as it can to take up the space. Now let's do the same thing for the second box. So now you see that the first two boxes are flexing equally for the amount of space that's left in the parent container. Again, the reason I say equally is because they both have a flex of 1. We're going to see an example of what happens when you flex a different amount of number as compared to your neighbors. So now let's flex all 3 of them. And what you'll see is that because they all have the same number, there's a total of 3 sections, and they're each taking up 1 of those 3 sections. So they're all responding, changing their width, depending on the size of the screen. But let's say we wanted to have the middle section maybe take up a little more space. Let's give it a flex of 3. So if you kind of look at this, that means we have a total of 5 sections, with the middle section taking up 3 of them. And as you can see here, the middle section is a lot bigger. Now they're all going to flex. They're all going to grow. But the middle one's definitely going to grow faster. Again, it's about proportions. So that's the first example. Now the next thing I want to do is, we don't want to do this. Inline styling is tough. So I'm going to take this out. And notice that this has a class of container, which means that we can go here and put display flex for that container. And this is very common practice. Again, every container you're going to use, especially if you're going to adopt the flexbox model of laying out, they're going to receive a display of flex. So I might as well just do it as a class. And let me run this again. Notice that it doesn't change anything. The next thing we could do is, this also is tough, having all this inline styling. So let's take this out. And what we can do, let's go to our CSS and let's target these particular divs. Now you might suggest, well, we already have a CSS rule that targets all the divs inside containers. That is true. but this will target all the divs inside all the containers. So it might be more beneficial for us to do it like this. So let's say example 1 div, and then give each of those divs that are inside example 1 a flex of 1. So at this point, I'm going to override. This was the 131. This is the 111. And there we go. So now we were able to give all the divs inside example 1 a flex of 1. So let's do another example. And for this one, I'm going to reduce this down to just 2 divs. Sometimes you may want to have a box within your container that's a fixed width. So that's what we're going to do here. So we're going to give our first box, let me run it, a set width of 150. Oops, and make this example 2. And then we're going to flex the other one. And again, I'm using inline styling, but obviously you can either use internal or external to accomplish the same thing. Now, because this is only one box being flexed, the number doesn't matter. You could put 2, you could put 3, you could put 5, you could put 100. It's not going to make it any bigger, because what this is saying is I have one box, because that's the only box that's being flexed, and I'm going to use up that one box. So you can see here that the first box retains its size of 150. It will not grow. It's not flexing. But the second box is. Again, this is another useful design in that you can have maybe something that won't necessarily need to grow or shrink, whereas the other side, we may want to be more flexible with how the content's being displayed. All right, so I'm going to go back to my first example for our next example. And we'll call this example 3. Let's just make sure it displays. Come on. All right, so while it's deciding to do that, example 3. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to give each of those divs a flex of 1. Okay, so now they're all equally spaced. But now I want to target the parent element, because if you notice, the boxes are set up in a row, whereas originally we had them set up vertically in a column. And that's what we could do. We could revert back to that design by simply specifying the flex direction to be column. So let's see how that works. And there we go. So this was the default layout of the divs before we did any flexing, and now we simply got back to that. So this might feel like a lot more work to do something like this, you know, to create the flex boxes and then to create the flex direction and create the flexes, where this was the default behavior. I will say, once you adopt the concept of using flexbox for your layout, do it for everything. Don't have mix match techniques on how to lay things out on your page. It's only going to confuse you in the end. All right, so flex direction allowed us to change the direction of the boxes inside. I will also tell you there's a concept of a major and minor axes, and that has now been changed. I'm going to let you kind of discover that on your own with further resources. Let's go back to another example now. I know that was kind of like my cop-out way of saying, I don't want to cover that in this video. So let's do example 4. And it's still a container. And for this example, we're going to use just one div. Now, in the past, web developers used to struggle to make an item completely centered in a div. Flexbox gives us a very convenient way of doing that. So let's run this, make sure that we get it. And let's make our box a little bigger. Let's give it a height of, let's say 200. So you could kind of think of this as maybe a banner on a web page, where now we want to be able to get this one, or wherever our title is, completely centered in that. So Flexbox gives us two convenient properties to allow us to do that. And I'm going to introduce them separately. So we've got justify content, center, and look at what happens. It moves the content towards the middle. So now we want to center it vertically. So now we could do align items, center. And this is a great way to get an item to be completely centered within a div. Again, that's something that you want to have as part of banners or some kind of big jumbo attention getter on your web page. So the last example we're going to do is a little more complex in that I'm going to show you how you can nest containers within each other. So for that, we're going to, let's say, what can we adopt? We'll just copy and paste this one. Call this example 5, and let's do 2 divs. And I'm going to do a little copy and paste. So obviously some of these things I'm doing with the examples with the divs, we could have done it as a class just to avoid the constant flex of 1, flex of 1, flex of 1. But hopefully this also enforces in you the idea that these two containers require a flex, or these two items require a flex. So we can see here we have equal portioning of the two containers. And now what I want to do is I want to further divide this container into 2 more boxes, but while still keeping this one as a whole. So we can do is we could change this second box also into a container. And let's give it 2 children inside. And we'll say 2, 2. And if you allow me, I think for this example, I'm just going to go for inline styling, so I'm not flipping back and forth between this and external CSS. Let's just run it, see what we get. So you can see here, here's our box of 1, and here are our 2 boxes. Now, we're not getting the separation of the 2 boxes over here because this box itself has a background of white. So let's just solve that real quick, just so you can physically see the 2 boxes. And I think at this point we can kind of close that up. Okay, so you can see here, here's our main box, here's our 2 sub boxes, but again, I didn't want them side by side because side by side, well, we could have done it using just the 1 layer of boxes. I wanted to have these stacked on top of each other. So what I can do, and again, I'm going to continue with this just within inline styling, is to do a flex direction on this inside container of column. And there we go. So now we have 1 box, 2 boxes over here. They're taking equal spaces. They will be responsive. But now the right side has 2 separate boxes that I can do whatever I want with. I could put a picture here, a link here, a picture here, a paragraph. I could have a paragraph on this side. So to create, more complex layouts, you're going to have to start embedding containers within containers. Again, with practice, this gets easier. So let's go back to our presentation. So in this lesson, we introduced Flexbox, which is a responsive tool for creating web page layouts. At the root of Flexbox is a concept of a container and its items inside. And there's various properties that can be set in order to specify how much each of those items inside the container should take up. So hopefully now you're excited. You're going to be able to create sophisticated web layouts to really start bringing your websites together. Enjoy.